So just a word about the format of the next I suppose few weeks as we try and work our way through the Geonim. As I mentioned last week, it's a little bit of an overwhelming topic because we're sort of trying to do 500 years of Jewish history, exceptionally vibrant, important years, years about which there are many mysteries still. There's a lot that's not known. And yet absolutely formative in I said what we call Judaism now in the Jewish world that we know now. So it's a little overwhelming. What I'm going to try and do is today is summarize, I suppose, some of the key achievements of the Geonim and also some of the controversies over that period. And in a moment, I want to mention that even talking about the period of the Geonim in some level is a sort of construct. And probably next week, we'll shift to the personality of Rav Saadia Gaon. Though I will try and talk a little bit, maybe 2 weeks' time, I'll try and talk a little bit about some of the other Geonim also. But amongst the key accomplishments of the era of the Geonim is nothing less than the birth of Jewish philosophy. So one of the things I often say is that Jews weren't philosophers traditionally. I've spoken many times in this series about everyone has a philosophy, everyone has a worldview. But the sort of structured manner in which we do philosophy now is very much an impact of the Greek way of thinking. And one of the ways I sort of bring this idea out is I talk about the difference between Agadah, Gemara, and Medrash, which convey philosophical ideas. They convey thoughts about life and meaning and purpose and truth and certainly theology, God and the relationship of God to humanity. But maybe it's a little bit akin to, I don't know, looking at a work of this is just a moshel, but if you learn a work of a great author, if you learn Shakespeare, you certainly understand enormous insights into human psychology. But he's not a systematic psychologist in the same way as maybe Freud was in introducing psychology as a science or pseudoscience. So that sort of systemization of thought is a Greek phenomenon and gradually spreading throughout the West. There are other ways of conveying meaning and purpose through poetry, through metaphor, through literature. And this is how Chazal did it. We don't find in Chazal, most of the time, systematic theology or philosophy in the way that we'd recognize it. Occasionally you see to find the volume button very quickly, Charles. It's absolutely fine. It happens. It's absolutely fine. We don't find in Chazal systematic theology most of the time, direct theological statements. Occasionally you'll find a rare reference to them, but how they did theology and philosophy was through medrash, through Agadah, through stories, through poems, through literature and the like. And they certainly didn't engage in systematic critique of other worldviews. You'll find occasional stories in the Gemara where a figure meets a heretic, and they have some sort of conversation, but not much more than that. The birth of theology, of philosophy, as a sort of science and a discipline in a modern manner, in a Western manner, in a Greek manner, is also a product of the Gaonic era, and in particular of Saadia Gaon, who in a sense we could call the first Jewish philosopher. His works aren't learned that much because in many ways his thoughts were superseded by the Rambam, the other great synthesizer of Greco-Arabic thought and its confrontation with Judaism. But Rav Saadia Gaon really laid the groundwork for that whole process. Okay, so just to summarize what I've said so far, we're trying to look at a period of 500 years, a difficult project. I'm going to try and today and perhaps next week summarize some of the key achievements of the Gaonic era and some of the key figures, and then we will shift to the most, from a philosophical point of view, the most outstanding figure of that era, Rav Saadia Gaon, who was the first Jewish philosopher, the first time Jews, at least on a highest level, on the first rank, presumably the other people in the era of Rav Saadia are beginning to do these things, the first sort of published author who writes a book and who on a prominent way begins trying to reformulate Jewish ideas in the language of Greco-Arabic reasoning. And this sort of synthesis that we spoke about when we discussed the Rambam of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and so on. So that's our project. Again, to remind ourselves, the Gaonic era spans the close of the era of the Talmud, roughly the year 500, 600. We spoke last week about some of the debates about exactly when the Talmud was sealed, through to about the year 1000, conveniently, so a convenient 400-500 year block. Around the year 1000, a little earlier, maybe 950, 900, Jews, significant Jewish communities who have perhaps always been present in terms of numbers, but not in terms of scholarly activity, emerge in France, in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in North Africa, and the centers of Gaonic learning in Bavel in Iraq become eclipsed, meaning to say there's still a very important Torah center there, but it is now one Torah center amongst many, as opposed to the Gaonic area, in which is the premier Torah center, in which the whole of Torah scholarship radiates out from Bavel, principally the two yeshivas of Sura and Pumbedita. I mentioned already Sura and Pumbedita at the beginning of the Gaonic era exist in places called Sura and Pumbedita. By the end of the Gaonic era, they've moved, not much like Ponevezh Yeshiva or Brisk Yeshiva is now found in Israel or in America, no longer in Brisk and Ponevezh. Baghdad has become an important Torah center, but this is the Gaonic era, from roughly the Chasimas HaTalmud, 500-600, through to 900-1000, when Torah personalities emerge in other centers, and the onset of the era of the Rishonim. The title Gaon, as I said, technically refers to the heads of the academies in Bavel, though there are other scholars of the first rank who are not Geonim, they're not heads of academies, and nonetheless write works that endure to this day, principally the BeHa, or the Halachos Gedolos. Who was the author of the Halachos Gedolos? The BeHa, the Baal Halachos Gedolos. But as far as we know, quite possibly not one of the Geonim, perhaps Shimon Kariates, not one of the Geonim. And I also mentioned that in the very early period of the spreading of Torah to other Torah centers, many of them called their Rosh Yeshiva also Gaon. So the first generations of Rishonim in North Africa, in Germany, in France, and so on, in Spain, that they refer to themselves, the heads of the yeshiva, as Gaon. But basically that title goes into decline, ceases to be used with the onset of the era of the Rishonim. Another significant shift that occurs during the era of the Rishonim is the move from Aramaic to Arabic. So in the beginning of the era of the Geonim, 500, 600, 700, Aramaic is the spoken language. That's the language of the Gemara. The Geonim can access Gemara directly. They're living in a relatively similar culture to that of the late Amaraim. By the middle of the Gaonic period, Bavel is already conquered very early in the first wave of Arab conquests, as this burst of energy spreads out from the Arabian Peninsula under the influence of the founder of Islam. Bavel falls very early to Arab conquerors. It doesn't immediately supersede Aramaic, but gradually Aramaic is driven to the fringes. It still exists in certain remote regions in the Middle East, in mountains of in Kurdish mountains and the like. But basic Aramaic, which is the spoken language, goes into decline, and gradually Jews shift to Arabic. That's another change that occurs during the Gaonic era. We once had at our table my wife and I, many years ago, we had someone who just turned up at shul or whatever it was, and we invited them to our house, was a scholar of Aramaic who had gone and lived in remote Kurdish villages in the mountains where they still speak Aramaic. I love the thought of sort of Kurdish tribesmen in mountains saying "Lamay nafkamina, etc." You know, that's my scene of them sits around their fires with their tents there in the cold Kurdish mountains, and maybe not quite accurate. Okay. So that's the summary of the period of the Geonim in terms of the sort of era of history. Okay, what did they do in this time? So quite simply, they put in place so many of the building blocks of what we would call Judaism now, and I mentioned them briefly last week in the introduction, but I just want to go through them in more detail. So first of all, how did Torah radiate out from Bavel? What was their manner of learning and teaching? So they had yeshivas, Sura and Pumbedita, principally, but other lesser yeshivas also. They taught Torah to generation after generation of students, and they crystallized many of the texts of the Torah, of the classic Torah. As I mentioned already, they're formative in creating the final version of the Gemara, and possibly the Gemara remains oral for many years. And possibly it's not even written down. Maybe it is written down. We don't know how early or late it was written down, but possibly even as late as the close of the Gaonic era. So they formalize and finalize the text of the Gemara. They teach Torah. They engage in machlokas, in polemics. In other words, attacking those who threaten the authority of the Talmud Bavli. So they are the ones who crystallize the Talmud Bavli as the central Shulchan Aruch, the central halachic work that canonized. They canonize it as the central text And we'll talk more about this later, but who do they fight against? They fight against a center in Eretz Yisrael that still exists. It's a much more minor Torah center, but there's machlokas with Eretz Yisrael. There's argument with the political hierarchy of Jewish leadership, the Reish Galusa that we'll speak about in a few minutes, who are not Gaonim, in many cases not Talmidei Chachamim, some of them were Talmidei Chachamim, but they are the political leadership of the Jewish people, and they ensure that whilst they can be the lay leaders, they can't be the Torah leaders of the Jewish world, and they fight later against the Karaites, the heretical view that only accepts the authority of Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, not the oral Torah. So that's one part of their activity, and we'll talk about more of that, all of that in more detail. They also issue basic texts, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And finally, they communicate initially with Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, and ultimately by the close of the Gaonic era with the whole Jewish diaspora. So they're writing letters back and forth to Spain and to North Africa and even to Italy, answering sha'ilas and explaining Judaism, and in so doing, establishing the authority of the Talmud Bavli. So all of this is part of their, I've been recording here, yes. All of this is part of their project. And the volume of she'elot or teshuvot, of correspondence from the Geonim, is remarkable, is massive. Now, this wasn't even realized through the generations. Through the generations, they had access to a small, a relatively limited quantity of Gaonic teshuvos, of letters back and forth, with the rise of particularly the Cairo Geniza, the so-called Cairo Geniza, the volume of correspondence of the Geonim it's only become appreciated relatively recently. This massive volume of constant ongoing communication between the Geonim and the rest of the Jewish diaspora. So again, now is not a shir about the Cairo Geniza, but very briefly, in a suburb of Cairo, it was a small Jewish town slightly outside Cairo, Fustat, there was a shul called the Ben Ezra Shul. Fustat, very important community where the Rambam flourished and so on. And there was a Geniza. Geniza is what we call a Shemus nowadays. It's a place where Jews dumped holy works that they wanted to dispose of, rather than them being destroyed or burnt or put in the regular rubbish collection. And there was a room off this Ben Ezra Shul where Jews put their shemus, actually, till relatively recently, till a couple of hundred years ago, Jews were putting their shemus there. And people began wondering, effectively, how long have Jews been putting shemus there? And as you begin unearthing the shemus and taking it out, it became clear, like archaeological layers, you go back 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, it's this vast room, a shemus box, effectively. But it's going back more and further and further and further, till remarkably it goes back close to 1,000 years, and it becomes this absolute treasure trove, one of the most amazing finds in Jewish history. And it includes everything. And we've done actually a shul trip to some of the fragments of the Cairo Geniza, and a most amazing find in Jewish history. And it includes works of classical Torah, which we would expect to be in Shemus. It also includes other Jewish documents like Kesuvas, it includes Aleph-based primers, and it includes a vast amount of correspondence. It seems there was a minhag at the time to even put into the Shemus box anything that included any Hebrew words, and therefore people included love letters and correspondence and business deals and documents and the like, and in the most incredible find in Jewish history. So much so that in many respects we know more about medieval Jewish culture than we know about almost any other culture in the world. If you think about us as a wandering diaspora folk without a homeland, without a base, the idea that of all medieval cultures we should be the most known about in some respects is truly astounding. Like normally in history, we know about kings and emperors and wealthy people. We don't know about common folk, and yet we know more about common folk in the Jewish world, perhaps from these finds and various others, than almost any other people. A remarkable thing. And one of the finds that emerged is the degree of response of the Geonim. They're writing constantly She'elot or Teshuvot back and forth to communities outside, and through that they are leading the Jewish people and cementing the authority of the Talmud Bavli and unifying the Jewish people into a cohesive mass. Again, a diaspora people, what keeps them on one practice? What stops all the different communities spinning apart? And one of the ways of doing this is constant communication. And sometimes it's very basic questions that are being asked, and sometimes very sophisticated questions being asked, indicating again the level of learning and scholarship in the other communities. How do they reply? They reply using Mishnah and Gemara and Minhag, predecessors, Svara, much like modern day Poskim. They reply in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and in Arabic. Initially in Aramaic, because they're speaking only to the local Bavel community. Then as Arabic takes over, they switch to Arabic. And then as they're speaking to further flung communities in North Africa and so on, they're writing in Lashon HaKodesh, they're writing in Hebrew. And as I said, collections of Gaonic teshuvos began appearing in the 1500s. They're published, and then in the 1800s, and then more recently, with the rise of the increasing scholarship and so on, Geniza fragments, particularly the figure of Louis Ginsburg and others. There's publication of more Otzar Gaonim, of more teshuvos of the Gaonim. This is a brief sort of summary of the one mode of influence of the Geonim. By the way, amongst the Shilas and Shuvas of the Geonim is a letter of Rav Sherira Gaon, known as the Igeres, the letter of Rav Sherira Gaon, which is one of the most important historical documents that we have. It gives us a lot of the history of the Chasimas HaTalmud that we spoke about, of the Talmud itself and the Geonim. So when you're struggling to learn Gemara and you're wondering about generations of Amaraim and how they relate to each other, and much of what I'm saying indeed about the Gaonim and how they operated and what went on there comes from this letter of Rav Sherira Gaon. Of course, historians want multiple sources, and of course, historians always ask, what's the agenda of the person writing the letter? Is Rav Sherira Gaon writing a version of history which fulfills certain aims? And again, that's not a controversial statement. He has aims. He wants to unify Klal Yisrael around the authority of the Gaonim. It doesn't mean it's the whole truth. It doesn't mean there's nothing else to say about the Gaonic period, but certainly it tells us much that we need to know about the period of the Gaonim. Okay, so that's a sort of overview of one aspect of their teaching. They're teaching Torah to their Talmidim, generation after generation, and they are writing letters back and forth. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about who their opponents are and Broigus, because that's an important part of any Jewish history. And this is important because this is certainly seeing off attacks against what we would call in anachronism Orthodox Judaism. Mainstream Judaism is very, very important. And then I want to spend the remaining time talking about the key formative elements of modern Jewish life that came into existence in the Gaonic era. So throughout Jewish history, since the period from the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash and on, we have records of movements and groups of people that opposed Torah Sheba'al Peh. So roughly speaking, I'm resuming my Nehemiah share on this Wednesday, so come to that if you want more details. But roughly speaking, the era of Tanakh comes to an end with the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash period. That's the onset of the era of the written Torah, that's the closure of the era of the written Torah. And now we enter into the oral Torah. Now, if you no longer have prophecy, if you no longer have direct communication from Hashem through prophecy, how do you know what to do? How do you carry on living? Tanakh is a large work. It's not always easy to understand. It uses language which is complicated. Sometimes on face value, it appears contradictory. It's difficult to interpret. It's got many lacunae. There's many details it doesn't give you. It's enigmatic. It's difficult to understand on many occasions. Moreover, life circumstances change, and you're not going to be able to open a pasuk and find out how to use a car or how to use automated vehicles. That's 2025 or cloning. But even in 425, before the Common Era, circumstances are changing. Political situations are changing. Second Beis Hamikdash is founded. It's not identical to the first Beis Hamikdash. It has a slightly different structure. There's no king. How do you apply Tanakh to modern circumstances? How do you begin knowing how to live a Jewish life based just on Torah Shebechsav? And our answer to the question is Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, often Torah Sheba'al Peh is translated as the oral Torah in the sense of received tradition. A small part of the oral Torah is received tradition. If you learn Gemara, there's several hundred halachos and Moshe Messinais. Much of oral Torah is interpretation, droshas, Yud Gimel Midas, hermeneutic principles from which we draw out rules and principles, svara, reasoning, and the like. And with the onset of the Second Temple era and the cessation of prophecy and the sealing of the canonical written Torah, immediately debate arises about the authority of the oral Torah. One group that we know are the group that we refer to as the Kusim. They refer to themselves as the Shomronim, coming from Shomron, Samaria. They're already mentioned, again, plug for the Nehemiah Ezra Shir. These are the group that are settled in Eretz Israel, perhaps moved there by Sancherev, and who oppose the return of the Jewish community to Eretz Israel after the Galusa Bavel. And they deny the authority of the Torah Shebaal Peh. One theory, by the way, as to their name, Shomronim, is that it's not linked to Shomron, Samaria, but Shomron means traditional. The Shmor means to guard. They say we are the traditionals, the guardians of the tradition. We're not coming with any of this innovative Torah Shebaal Peh stuff. We are traditionalists. We are keeping the way. We're just taking the words of Hashem, unmediated through the word of the scholars. So this is already very early, 500 years before the Common Era. There's controversy around the onset of the rabbinic era, if you like, again an anachronistic term, but the onset of the Torah Shebaal Peh season and authority. So this is the Kusim. In the era of the close of the second Beis HaMikdash, when there's enormous turmoil in the Jewish world and heretical spin-offs, again, we find this debate arising. So you have, I suppose we'd call them the ancestors of the Orthodoxy, or again, anachronism, Mishnaic era, the Purushim, the Pharisees, one sect. You have other sects. One sect goes on to flourish and become a new religion, Christianity, who also are troubled by Torah Shebaal Peh as it happens. But there are other groups that also question Torah Shebaal Peh. Again, when you learn the Mishnah, you hear about the Tzedokim, the Baisusim, the Tzaddakites, the Tzedokim, the Baisusim. Josephus references the Essenes. We have the Dead Sea settlers, who we know about from the other great finds of last century, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, who either are their Essenes or aren't their Essenes, but they're certainly their own group, all of whom, again, question rabbinic authority and don't like the sort of system of rabbinic interpretation. Have I mentioned the pun of the Dead Sea settlers? One of the oldest puns I'm aware of in history is the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found, again, without going through the whole story, basically 100 years ago, a Bedouin goat herd tending his goats in the Dead Sea mountains. The area of the Dead Sea is desert, but there's shrubs that grow there. And one of his goats wanders into a cave. He goes into the cave and he finds there something bound in leather. He takes it to a dealer, and with that you have the onset of a very brief of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, remarkably preserved scrolls in the Dead Sea area, which again on an absolute treasure trove of Jewish history, incredible find, preserved by the hot, dry climate of the Dead Sea region, remarkably preserved. Go and see them in the Israel Museum and elsewhere. Absolute obligation for anyone who has any interest in history or just any desire to touch the past. Incredible find dating back 2,200 years, and so an amazing find. Now, what do the finds tell us? Well, the finds tell us that this is a breakaway group that lives in the Dead Sea area. They break away from mainstream body of Jews in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim. They have Tanakh, and obviously a significant part and interest of the finds of the Dead Sea Scrolls is Tanakh, with a remarkable alignment to what we call the Masorah, to the traditional text of Tanakh. Many years ago, I gave a series on biblical criticism, and I spoke about the degree of alignment to the Masorah and the degree of misalignment, but remarkably aligned, an incredible find. But it also includes polemical works, right? Where you have Jews, you have Machlokes, you have Broigus, and they attack their rivals in Yerushalayim. And they have a whole theology that we don't go with, battles between the forces of light and the forces of dark and everything else. But they also attack the mainstream centers in Yerushalayim. And one of the things they don't like is they don't like the rabbis. They don't like the high priests, they don't like the rabbis and so on, and they attack them. And there they speak dismissively, and here we get to the pun. They speak about the Dorshei Chalakot, the smooth, slippery, chalak means smooth, the slippery-tongued, the seekers of slippery-tongued reasoning. Basically, what we would now call, these hair-splitting rabbis that play games and so on. But what they're really doing is a pun, because of course Chazal call themselves, we are doreish halachas. That's why it's called drasha. Doesn't mean what the rabbi gives a pulpit sermon. Drasha means lidrosh, to seek out deeper meaning. The Yud Gimel Midrash Torah nidreshet b'hem, a drasha. Whenever the Gemara says we're learning or deriving a halachic principle, we are doresh the pasuk. So Chazal is dorish. What are they dorish? They are dorish halachot, dorshei halachot, dorshei halachos. The Dead Sea people say you're not dorshei halachos, you're dorshei chalakot. You're seekers of slippery-tongued, hair-splitting distinctions. They don't like Gemara. They don't like that style of reasoning. They don't like the sort of rabbinic reasoning. Okay, so you have the Kusim mentioned in Halacha as sects who, early Second Temple era, you have the Tzedokim and the Baisusim, late Second Temple era, who disagree with Torah Sheba'al Peh. And this remains somewhat of a running controversy through the Mishnaic era. And then we fast forward to the Gaonic era, middle of the Gaonic era, sometime around the 700s, and a new sect arises called the Karaites, the Karaim, who again dismiss Torah Sheba'al Peh, and they say back to text only, back to Torah Shebechsav, that's where we should be deriving truth from. Now, there is a lot of controversy as to how the Karaite sect arose and to what degree it's a continuation of previous groups. In other words, are the Karaites a new group that arises in the 700s, or does it simply emerge to prominence then for whatever historical reasons, which we'll touch upon? But really, it's a sort of, does it bear a lineage or continuity with, for example, the Tzedokim, with the late Second Temple era group? Were there always groups of Jews who denied Torah Sheba'al Peh through the ages? Or is this a sort of group that arises there in the 700s from nowhere? And the answer is we don't really know for sure. To some degree, this depends who asks, because Karaites have their own traditions and Orthodox Jews have their own traditions. But historians think that it doesn't have continuation, and they don't think there was a sort of large grouping. Presumably, through the generations, there were always the rare individual who was a free thinker who questions sort of orthodoxy and the normal view. But we don't know of sort of large collectives in the the 200-300 years before the Karaites who disagreed with Torah Sheba'al Peh. We don't have really a record of controversy of large groups of Jews who are arguing with the rabbinic authorities about this. So as far as we know, this is a relatively new phenomena that arises. Now, it arises in the middle of the Gaonic era, associated with a figure called Anan ben David. He is, if you like, the founder of the Karaites, at least from an Orthodox point of view and from a historical point of view. Karaites say, no, he's merely one in a chain of tradition. Either way, in the final years, I don't know, 760 and on, Anan ben David was born in 715, 760 and on, Karaites suddenly emerge as a powerful force within the Jewish world. Who was Anan ben David? We don't know an enormous amount. Anan's a very unusual name. What's the meaning of the word Anan? Cloud, right? It's not a name that we find other Jews being called. Is it his literal name? Is it a pen name, or telling us something about his personality? We don't really know. We don't really know about his background. Our sources tell us that he was, we'll come to this later, from the royal family. He came from the family of the Reish Galusa, the royal sort of lay leadership family of the Jewish world. Our sources say that he was disgruntled. He was passed over for a leadership role and decided to seek his revenge against the mainstream Jewish body, and therefore set up his own authority. Again, we don't know if that's a polemic story or a true story. Who knows? But he reestablishes a body of views that oppose the authority of rabbinic interpretation, Torah Sheba'al Peh, and he creates or brings to life at least a resurgence of the Karaites movement. For those interested in historical influence, there was a figure in the Arab world, the Muslim world, called Ibn Khanifa, who, according to some traditions, had a connection with Anan ben David, and possibly they shared a prison cell. In other words, the authorities, the Muslim authorities, didn't like either figure because they are co-heretics. But there is a movement that arises in the Muslim world, the Hanifite movement, that is very similar in terms of how to interpret the Quran. So we're only 100 years after the writing of the Quran, and there's already similar debates in the Muslim world about to what degree is that it? Everything is in the Quran, just read the text and you know what to do. And to what degree do you need to interpret and draw out principles and so on from it? So there's similar debates in the Muslim world, and it's possible, again, historians who like linking similar movements that arise at similar times and chains of influence and so on, it's possible there's a link between these two movements. This is a perennial problem, by the way, for any text-based canonized religion. In the Christian world, Kaviyachal, you have similar debates with the rise of Protestantism, right? Part of it, again, not our job to speak out other theologies, but part of the debate between the Catholic and Protestant world is to what degree can you go back to the text, open a Bible, and unmediated just read it and learn it, and you'll know about what God wants from you, or to what degree do you need the interpretive authority of the Catholic Church and its received traditions and the popes and so on? This is part of the debate. So this is a sort of common theme. Either way, Anan ben David creates or brings back to life maybe a small movement or maybe a non-existent movement, and Karaites spring into existence. Sorry, you wanted to ask something? Yeah. Yes, because because it disappears. The question is, why should we assume or not assume that Karaites are or not a continuation of the Sadducees, the Sadokim? The answer is because they disappear. So the Shomronim, the Samaritan community remains, by the way, to this day. It's a very, very small community. In the Mishnaic era, when Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael, there's still reference to debates with the Shomronim and their halachic status. By the time the center of gravity is shifted to Bavel, you don't find reference to the Samaritans. They're a small community living to this day in the HaGrizim area. I think I've shared it before when I was in Israel over the sabbatical. I had the very interesting and fascinating experience of visiting the Shomronim community in HaGrizim. You have to sort of check the security situation before you visit, but if you're able to visit, very, very interesting to see Jews still living in quasi-Jews there. Their halachic status already in the time of the Mishnah was unclear. Do I have time to go off subject and just tell you a bit about this story or not? Is this okay? Okay, I apologize, but so in basically in the Mishnaic era, as I said, from the according to our sources, from early in the Second Temple period all the way through to modernity, Shomronim existed. In the New Testament, the founder of Christianity tells a story about a poor man who is sneered at by Kohen, sneered at by a Levi. You would expect the person who then looks after him, which should be a commoner, should be Yisrael. But it's not, because he wants to dig at the Jewish world. Instead, it's the Good Samaritan, right? Who's the Good Samaritan? It's the Shomroni who helps him. It's a Samaritan who helps him. So they're around, and the Mishnah mentions controversy around the Samaritans. In direct answer to your question, the Mishnah mentions controversy around the Sadokim. By the time we get to Gemara and early Gaonim, we don't find any polemical works. We don't find stories about Gaonim or late Amaraim being bothered by this heretical view. So again, absence evidence, never evidence of absence, but you would expect to find polemics if this is a significant force. So what's the answer? Either it's disappeared, or it's very, very small and no one can really be bothered for them. They're such a minority. Then suddenly the Karaites arrive in the 700 and everything explodes, and we'll get back to the subject soon, and we'll talk about the Geonim fighting. They become a real threat to mainstream Judaism. So either they've really gone beneath the surface, underground, and there's little cells of people, but they're not known about, or there's, I assume there's always the odd individual that question things in life. But as far as we know, there's no big movement. They're certainly not rivaling. No one can be bothered to talk to them. Yeah. If you're not attacking an opponent, it means they're insignificant. So as far as we can tell, there's no systematic Karaite group before that. Sorry, yes. Yeah. There are differences to this day, theological differences, and also early Karaite writers do not ascribe influence to the Sadokim or the Kusim. It's only later when they're trying to retro history how ancient their movement is, because no one wants to admit that in Judaism, everything is new old. In other words, no one ever in Judaism admits to a new idea. It's always, we are the originals, we're getting back to basics. Eventually, maybe movements acknowledge new ideas. But even, again, I want to, the founding fathers of Reform, we're purifying Judaism. We're going back to the original Judaism. At Chassidus, again, one day, please God, we'll do a series on Chassidus. Then we're not inventing new ideas. We're going back to the old. We're just maybe putting different emphasis on things and so on. So the Karaites also eventually establish an ancient, what we're doing is the real Judaism. It's the rabbis who are making up new stuff. So later Karaite historians, it's the best of my recollection, around the year 1000 and so on, begin ascribing ancient history to the Karaites. So as far as we know, there's no real sphere of influence. Okay, back to digression. Just very quick about the Shomronim. As I said, the Shomronim exist as a very, very small community to this day. They live primarily in the HaGrizim area and a small group in Cholon. I visited both communities as classical just because I was interested in them. And they have unique status in Israeli politics. they live in the West Bank in Shomron, and they have Palestinian citizenship and also Israeli citizenship. In Israeli law, if you take Palestinian citizenship, you can't be an Israeli citizen. If you're Israeli citizen, you can't be a Palestinian citizen. They are granted both because they fit this uneasy territory in which they are Jewish, somewhat. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they are also, they've been there. No one denies they've been there all the way through. Unlike us, they didn't leave. They were there in HaGrizim. Very, very small community, a few hundred families. They still live in the Har Gerizim area. Har Gerizim is near Har Bracha. Those who know the book, the Sefer Penina Halacha by Rav Melamed, he's just one mountain over. Har Gerizim, of course, is an important biblical site, the Har Gerizim and Har Evel, where the brachas and the klolos took place. The reason Har Bracha is called Har Bracha is because it's one mountain over, and that's the closest where you have a Jewish settlement linking the bracha and so on. But briefly, go back to the times of Tanakh, and when the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael, they're told to stand in the valley between Har Gerizim and Har Evel in Shomron, and face towards Har Gerizim and give the brachas, face towards Har Evel and give the klolos, and they're in the valley in the middle. The reason they're told to face these two mountains is because they're symbolic. They are basically near identical mountains right next to each other, but because of rainfall pattern, Har Evel is completely barren and Har Gerizim is very, very fertile. And you can still see it to this day. You see very green Har Gerizim, very barren Har Evel, because of the way the clouds get blown in the direction they get blown. Basically, they dump all their rainwater on Har Gerizim and Har Evel doesn't get any. In the middle is the valley. Nowadays, you can't go to the valley. Shechem has extended into the valley. Original Shechem with Kever Yosef is sort of out of the valley, but modern day Shechem sort of shifts into the valley, so you can't go into the valley, but you can go on Har Gerizim. And Har Gerizim, the Kusim ascribe, the Samaritans ascribe holiness to it. They say that's where the Beis Hamikdash should be, that's where korbanos should be sacrificed, and the like, because that's mentioned in the Torah. Right? Again, remember, the Torah doesn't label Yerushalayim anywhere. There's no reference to Yerushalayim being the center of the thing. So what's the holy mountain in the Torah? Well, they argue it's Har Gerizim. So that's where they live, and that's where they've remained to this day. And they live in Torah Shabbat. So I'll just mention the most visible example of this. The Pasuk says that you're meant to write a text and put it on your doorpost, right? Well, it doesn't quite say that. What do we read in Shema? Ksavtem al mezuzos beisecha uvisharecha. You should write on the mezuzahs of your doorways and on the gates, on the gateways. Now, what's the meaning of the word mezuzah? Mezuzah doesn't mean the little box you stick on your doorpost. Mezuzah means the doorpost itself, right? That's the meaning. So you should write on the doorpost and on the gateways. So you go to this Samaritan village, and there you see written etched into the stone of the doorway, you see the text of Shema. You can't read the text of Shema because they still use the ancient Ksav Ivri, not Ksav Ashurit. Again, beyond the scope of Asher. But around 2,500 years ago, Jews switched the font that they used for Hebrew from Ksav Ivri, from the ancient Hebrew text, to Ksav Ashuri, to the current square sort of lettering that we know. Maybe one day a subject for Ashir, why that switch happened, how that switch happened, but they didn't accept that switch. They still use Ksav Ivri. So there in Ksav Ivri, you can read the text of the Shema written on the doorpost. That's just one example. A second example, they still have korbanos. They still offer on Har Gerizim the Korban Pesach. They still have a Kohen Gadol. A remarkable story. I went into Har Bracha to the Makolet, and the owner of the Makolet is a fellow called Avi Cohen. And I bought whatever I bought. I can't remember, something, a bit of food there. And then I went over to Har Gerizim, and I passed the Makolet there, also owned by another Avi Cohen. But this second Avi Cohen has the distinction of being the son of the Kohen Gadol. So if you ever want to go into it's quite a surreal experience. You're going to the Makolet owned by Avi Cohen, whose yichus is with his father's Kohen Gadol. It's just quite a remarkable, almost alter reality. It feels very, very surreal. Okay, so sorry. Yeah, so this is the in Ksav Ivri. Yeah. Written in the Sefer Torah, written in Ksav Ivri, 100%. Okay, so again, all this is beyond the scope of our discussion, but there's a very, very small movement there. Unfortunately, we cannot accept their. So were their yichus, their genealogy, to be reliable? We would say, what are they? They are halachic Jews who have non-halachic views. Okay, I mean, join the club. There's unfortunately many Jews like that. However, already in the times of the Mishnah, there were questions about their ancestry and their descent, and to what degree they were original Jews or different groups that had married into them or perhaps even formed them. And certainly in modernity, there's a very serious problem there because they pose a route to get Israeli citizenship. Basically speaking, to get Israeli citizenship, you have to fulfill the criteria of the law of return, or if you're not Jewish by birth, you have to be in Niskaya, you have to convert to Judaism, which is a difficult and hard-working, very laborious process. The Kusim, or the Samaritans rather, are entitled by Israeli law to have members of their community have Israeli citizenship, and they have their own control over the conversion, over who they count as Samaritans. So it's become a route to get Israeli citizenship. Most recently, they have a population crisis, they have a demographic issue, they have genetic disease, unfortunately, because they're such a small community. And the Kohen Gadol issued a recent psak that they were allowed to take in Ukrainian women as immigrants and grant them Samaritan status and thus Israeli citizenship status under Israeli law. And there's several tens of Ukrainian women. So that's just an example of the Yichus problems, which unfortunately and sadly means that from a halachic point of view, we can't treat them as halachically Jewish. We can't be certain of their Jewish status. Okay. Yes. These are psukim. Okay, there's very serious questions, which Leonard is right to point out, which is if you don't accept Torah Sheba'al Peh, how on earth do you know what to do? Right? I think I gave a series here, possibly during COVID, but possibly it's online, about Torah Sheba'al Peh and authenticity of Torah Sheba'al Peh and historical records, events on. I'm not going to go through all of that, other than if you don't accept Torah Sheba'al Peh, you're in a serious difficulty, right? As I mentioned, knowing how to live based on the written Torah is very, very difficult. There's an array of things that are just profoundly problematic. How on earth do you know how to live? I'm not going through all of that again. It's not my job to defend Karaites or defend Chushiel and justify how they do it. Other than these points are made by the Geonim in their response to Karaitism when they attack it. Yes. Yes. Okay, so there are diversions between their text and our text. It's roughly the same, but there are differences. And research indicates that the Masoretic text is more accurate. So again, it gets back to Dead Sea Scroll and other things like that. Okay. Yeah. Karaites are the grammarians, not the Samaritans. We'll come to the Karaites in a few minutes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So in brief, all of that is digression. Apologies. In brief, but everyone voted for it live, and those of you online, you don't get a vote. You have to come online to get a vote, I guess. Okay. So back to subject. We are in the era of the Geonim. And the Geonim are now having to grapple with the rise of this new heretical movement. Let me just spend a few minutes talking about the Karaites. The Karaites are frum. What do I mean by frum? This isn't an agenda to be lenient in halacha. In many ways, they have certain leniencies, but they also have certain extreme stringencies. This isn't a movement designed to make Judaism more user-friendly or lighter or easier. In that sense, you could argue it sounds lishma. Right? Someone who becomes a Karaite is doing so not because he's getting the easy life, he's getting an equally tough life, and in some respects more tough. To give a couple of examples of chumras of the Karaites, one very famous chumra is the pasuk says, "Lo savaru eish b'chol moshe seichem b'yom haShabbos." Lo savaru eish. Does lo savaru eish means don't light a fire on Shabbos, or does it mean don't burn a fire on Shabbos? What's the nafkamina? What's the difference between the two? If you have a light lit before Shabbos, is that okay? Or does it mean don't have lights burning over Shabbos? Which one is the prohibition? Now, we understand the prohibition is doing acts on Shabbos. Don't light a light on, don't kindle is the old-fashioned word, right? Don't kindle a light on Shabbos. Don't light a light on Shabbos. But if you have light lit before Shabbos, then you're fine. As a result, we have nice bright homes on Shabbos. We have hot food on Shabbos because we can have fires burning on Shabbos. Karaites think not. The Karaites say, Lo savaru eish b'chol moshe seichem means fire shouldn't be burning in your house on Shabbos. Therefore, they sit in the dark, they don't have light, and they have cold food on Shabbos, no cholent. So that's an example of a Karaite chumrah. Now, joking aside, it could well be, according to some sources, that the Takonos Chazal of Hadlokos Neros Shabbos, which dates back to the Gemara era, is against those who make this heretical claim in that era of history. And it could be that the minhag of dafka eating hot food on Shabbos day dates back to the fight against the Karaites. There's a Bal Hamor, much later source, post-Gaonic source, that indicates that this was established in the Gaonic era. It's not obvious to have hot food Shabbos morning, right? Friday night you want hot food, it's cold, it's nighttime. But lunch, which of us have a hot lunch always? Maybe you can have perfectly delicious cold lunch on Shabbos morning. Friday night, by the way, the Karaites, of course, can have hot food because you heat the food before Shabbos and then you wrap it up. And Friday night you can have hot food. But Shabbos day, they don't have hot food. So maybe the establishment of what's a very ancient Jewish practice to deliberately have slow cooking foods across the Jewish world. People have slow cooking foods. You can call it chamim, you can call it cholent, but Jews have these slow cooking foods on Shabbos morning. Maybe according to the Bal Hamor, a product of the battle against Karaites. Karaites find it very hard to eat meat. Again, Leonard mentioned the question of Torah Sheba'al Peh, how you know what shechita is, who can do shechita, is to what degree is shechita a ritual program, and the like. So there's a whole array of areas in which the Karaites are very machmir. Another feature, by the way, of it is that there can be more change. Because if you don't believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh, then each generation is trying to relook at Torah Shebechsav itself, the written Torah itself, and trying to interpret it. Either way, this is the long-running battle with the Karaites. Let's fast forward in time. The Karaites arise in the late 760s, let's say, under the influence of Anan ben David. They take off. They become very, very popular. Perhaps as many as a third of all Jews end up as Karaites, as high as that. And this is a battle that lasts all the way through to the 1200s. So the Rambam in Fustat in Cairo sees part of his role as continuing the fight against the Karaites. So it's as late as that there's still the battle going on. In Fustat, in Cairo, in the life of the Rambam, there's still a flourishing Karaite community. There's a Karaite shul. We have in the Cairo Geniza a ksuva between a Karaite and a Orthodox Jew, again, anachronistic term, but what we'd call an Orthodox Jew marrying each other. And in the ksuva, they spell out terms and conditions. How are we going to live, right? Who's going to make the decisions about the cooking of the food and the kashrus? Who are we going to ask Achai to? How are we going to raise the children? And they thrash out all these details in this ksuva in order to resolve the problem. So Karaites remain a vibrant group until the 1200s. After that, they go into decline and never pose after that a threat to mainstream, what we would call mainstream Judaism. However, they continue to exist. And if we fast forward to let's say the year 1930, in Egypt, you have Arabic-speaking Karaites who are still there as a very, very small fringe group of the Jewish world. And in East Europe, you have Yiddish-speaking Karaites living in East Europe, in the Crimea. And they look like, if you saw a photo of them, you'd see people with beards and sometimes payas, and sometimes they were Yiddish-speaking, and some of them were scholars. Very small community, but they're existing. With the rise of Nazism, they convince, this is a very dark period of Jewish history, they convince the Nazis that they are not Jewish and therefore should be seen as their own group. Who can blame them? That's a way to survive. There are evidence of the Nazis consulting Orthodox scholars to ask them if that's true, and the Orthodox scholars confirm them to save their lives. No one wants them to die, to be killed. A very, very controversial fact of Karaite history that remains controversial to this day and very hotly debated. They are very important in manuscript research. There's a very, very important, Pilkoff, his name was a very important collector of Judaica, pre-Second World War, accused of being a plagiarizer and a forger and so on, very, very a whole vibrant history. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. And with 1948, they moved to Eretz Yisrael, and you have a reunion between these two disparate branches of the Karaite family, the Crimean Karaites and the Egyptian Karaites, and they coalesce. They have a shul to this day in not Rishon, in Ramla. I've been to visit the shul in Ramla and spoken to some of them. Very, very interesting. They have a shul, by the way, in the old city. There's no minyan there, or nothing takes place. It's dormant. But in the old city, just opposite, the big square next to the Chorva of Rabbi Yehuda. So just there in the corner is a Karaite shul. Yeah, sorry, Avram and then Charles. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's Arab cemetery, the Jewish cemetery.
Yeah.
One has just been redone.
Yeah, interesting.
And there was a burial there about
Interesting. So they still exist. They have a branch in America, by the way, but they're very, very small and several hundred families. And sort of the big debate, as it were, the big threat. Again, that's an example of when movements go dormant, when you cease to see people speaking much about them because they're no longer interesting because they cease to be a threat. So basically, the Geonim won. The Geonim, with the help of the earlier Rishonim, Karaism is removed from the Jewish conversation. Yes, John. Yes, you. Someone mentioned that. Maybe you, last time we spoke about the Karaites. Yes, forgive me for repeating myself. I googled it after you sent me the details. It's not even a Karaite community. I think it's one family, quite literally. You sent me the details, and I looked into it. Yes, I think there's a link to the school in there at the time, and yeah, yes, yes. Ah, okay, so very, very interesting. But I believe, to the best of my knowledge, it's literally one family here in the UK. To the best of Google. After you mentioned this to me, thank you for mentioning that. Okay, sorry, Charles.
I would say that the Karaites were responsible for the oldest extant Bible, the Leningrad Codex, which is in St. Petersburg in the library there, in the Imperial Russian Library.
Right.
You can go and see it.
Okay, so when I always tell my kids, if you're in a conversation and you want to duck the issue, you say arguably. So arguably so. Okay, so let me speak about that because it actually connects. Who mentioned about grammar? Charles. Okay, so let me just link the 2 points. In the 800s, this actually morphs quite neatly into our next conversation. So just to summarize what we've said so far. The Geonim wage a battle against Karaites. The later Geonim wage a battle against Karaites, and eventually triumph, perhaps 2 centuries after the end of the era of the Geonim. They also, and this we will only have time to address next week, fight for the authority of Talmud Bavli, in other words, over other traditions. And parallel to the rise of the authority of the Geonim is the decline of the authority of Eretz Yisrael. And next week, we will look at the great battle between the Geonim and the Rosh Yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael. Very, very important, really important part of Jewish history. However, just for now, I want to mention 2 more features about the Karaites. The first is that in Eretz Yisrael, from the 500s, 400s and on, Talmudic scholarship declines. There are still yeshivas. I mentioned already that the Talmud Yerushalmi never achieves the same authority as Talmud Bavli because it isn't edited properly. There's a decline in Talmudic scholarship, though there's still yeshivas. However, there are still Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael was not a wasteland of Jews ever, really, and particularly still flourishing Jewish life in the Galil, particularly. And in Tiberia, in the 800s, arises families of scholars who put extreme effort into verifying the text of the Torah and producing codexes. Codex is a posh way of saying a book as opposed to a scroll. And they produce codexes of texts of the Torah. And the text they're using is what we call the Masorah. And they write the so-called Masoritic texts, a word which is mole or choseh. Right? In Hebrew, you can write a word with a vav or without a vav, with a yud or without a yud. The spelling of words, kriyoksiv, right? I know the word na'aros, spelled without a hey at the end. All these sorts of things. The Bali Masorah regulate it, record it, and to this day we use Masoritic text notes. We use these notes which authenticate the text of the Torah. Very, very important work. They also standardize the laning notes, how they are symbolized. They standardize the vowels and how they are symbolized. Very, very important scholarship going on in the year 800 roughly in Tiberia. And there are 2 principal families, generation after generation, of scribes and Bali Masorah who work on this. Ben Osher and Ben Naphtali, that's the family names. The founder of one family is Osher, the founder of the other family is Naphtali. Then there's the Ben Osher family and the Ben Naphtali family. The text that we use to this day is based on the Ben Osher family. The Rambam had a particular codex known as the Aleppo Codex, later because it later moved to Aleppo to Chalav in Syria. And this became the standardized, the authentic text of the Torah. Again, we're talking about very relatively small discrepancies here and there of letters, but very important, obviously, for us, that we want it to be letter perfect. There is a The Aleppo Codex is the oldest non-complete text of the Torah. The Leningrad Codex that Charles mentions is the oldest complete text of the Torah, though dating later than the Aleppo Codex and less valuable. Aleppo Codex, sadly and tragically, parts of it went missing or destroyed or burnt in the riots in Syria, the 50s, 48 and 48 itself it was in the 50s. And part of it went missing. Most tragic loss in history. Aleppo Codex is the same book that the Rambam used to authenticate his text of the Torah. Yes. So basically speaking, very briefly, history is the Rambam had access to it. He wrote his Sefer Torah based on it. He passed it on to his descendants. Many generations after the Rambam, some of his descendants moved to Chalav in Syria, and that's where it remained, and it became known as the Chalavi or Aleppo Codex, Kata Aram Sova. And it was transcribed beforehand, so we have a record of what it says, but we've lost parts of the original. Either way, there are those that claim that these families were Karaites, in which case the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex were arguably written by Karaites. Historians debate. Yeah.
They claim that a Karaite
Yes.
had the codex.
Yes.
Not that he necessarily
Yes.
wrote that they wrote.
Both claims are made, and it's possibly, arguably, we don't know. We don't know. Arguably, that's how I duck this question, given that I've only got 3 minutes till I have to dash from my other shape. Okay, one final point I want to make is, and then we will have to finish for today, is the following: what did we get out of? What positives did we get out of the Geonim's battle with the Karaites? The answer is we got the first time a formulation of much of what we take for granted today. So had the challenges forced things to be written down and spelt out. So the Geonim only really wrote history works because of the Karaite challenge. So the Karaites came along and said, well, where'd you get Hirsch Balper from and so on? So who maps the lineage of so much of what was oral in the times of the Geonim became written down as a result of the Karaite challenge? So figures like Rishonim, Gaon and others write down the chain of transmission. You can find online to this day or printed, the chain of transmission from Yeshua to the mission others already establishes this, perhaps because of the Sadoki, the chain of transmission down to the early Mishnaic era rabbis. But from then on, which Mishnah era rabbi taught which one, and on and through to the Amaraim and through to the Geonim, this is what the Geonim went. What is Torah Shebal Peh? How do droshes work? What's the authority of droshes? How do we know that Torah Shebal Peh is needed? Many of the arguments that are used to this day with someone who's questioning the authority of Torah Shebal Peh. How do we know what Shechita looks like? How do we know what Mila looks like? How do we know how the calendar works? All the questions, all of these, how do we know how marriage takes place? How do we know how divorce takes place? These are all of these sorts of systematic formulations were written by the Geonim in response to the Karaite threat. So thanks, as it were, to the Karaite threat, we have the first systematic Jewish histories. We have the first formulations of what Torah Shebal Peh is. I'll simply mention that one way of thinking about, in a sense, modernity is rather than being immersed in an experience, you sort of meta think about the experience. You step out of the experience and have to define it. Till the Karaite threat, Jews just did what Jews did. They didn't sort of step out and define, how do we know that? Why is Torah Shebal Peh necessary? What are droshes doing? What is Torah Shebal Peh doing? What is the role of the transmission of the Torah? It was the threat of the Karaites that made Jews sort of step out and formulate. And history is by the way, in a sense, a Greek invention. Humans always tell stories. They live in their traditions, but the idea of stepping back and sort of weighing up historical records and trying to deal with them is in a sense not a thing that Jews traditionally did. But the Karaites force Jews to start writing history. So for the purposes of today, that's one of the major battles of the Karaites, of the Geonim, and one of the major outcomes that we have from the Geonim is we have the first records of Jewish history and chain of tradition. In Hashem, next week we'll speak about the remaining controversies in the era of the Geonim and what we got out of that, and then hopefully, I guess, 2 weeks off, we'll start talking about Rosh Hashanah and so on. I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. We appreciate it as always.